Welcome to Silicon Wafers, episode 28, where we take a deep dive into stories of the day relating to Russia's war in Ukraine. Today, Nothing to See Here, how the Russians at War propaganda film paints the Russian invaders and occupiers as victims. And this is one of those rare instances where I record one of these and it very much tracks what is actually happening in the news at the moment. And indeed, we're going to incorporate some breaking news into this episode. Outrage has erupted over a film created by Russian director and propagandist Anastasia Trofimova called Russians at War. Calls for its screening to be pulled from the Toronto International Film Festival have intensified. Surely, festival organisers should have reacted when the film was showcased at the Venice International Film Festival, despite the public uproar that it caused. And here is the breaking news. As this episode was being scripted and recorded, the Canadian broadcaster TVO made a statement that it had withdrawn support from the documentary Russians at War following protests from the Ukrainian community, and in fact, protests that are far wider than that. But the controversy surrounding the screening of the film pales beside news that the film was part financed by the Canadian government to the tune of 312,000 US dollars. This, despite the fact Canada is an ally of Ukraine in its existential fight against the Russian army. That rabble army of murderers, looters, and rapists that the Canadian Russian filmmaker Anastasia Trofimova seeks to absolve and whitewash of their documented war crimes. This is the accusation, but does it stand up to scrutiny? This video examines the controversy and the film itself to understand if the propaganda motive outweighs any artistic merits that the film may have. Russians at War positions itself as an anti-war documentary. It seeks to humanize Russian soldiers, and the director describes the Russian soldiers she filmed as absolutely ordinary guys with a sense of humor. So, what are those soldiers doing in someone else's country, we should ask? They are tools in a political game, suggests Trofimova. Straight off, this is a classic Soviet trope, which is even articulated by many so called opponents of Putin's regime. That is, that the war is not a simple case of one country invading another at the behest of a deluded dictator, but a complex plot concocted by the global military industrial complex, a plot perhaps even to trap Russia in starting a war. Russia's leaders, according to this trope, were tricked into the war, and in turn, the simple people were tricked by their leaders to fight for it. It's a handy way of absolving people from responsibility for their actions and their crimes, from the leaders of the regime right down to the lowliest soldiers. There is something like 150,000 documented war crimes committed by Russian forces in Ukraine since 2022. The actual number combined with undocumented crimes is likely to be many times higher than that. Putin did not personally commit each of these crimes. Each was, in fact, done by an individual Russian based on conscious choices that they made, and probably with a sense that the crimes would go unpunished. In some instances, genocidal crimes have been rewarded by the regime, conspicuously rewarded with honors, medal, money, etc. So they act in an environment of impunity, but nonetheless retain some choice in whether to commit the crimes or not. Indeed, in the eyes of international law, they will be held accountable for their individual actions. In this light, the film can be seen as an affront to Ukrainian victims of the war. The Ukrainian Canadian Congress has also lobbied hard for the film to be pulled. When I was writing this, it was that without success, but of course, they have now succeeded in achieving that. Of course, now the film is cancelled, this may also provide a propaganda win for the Kremlin. They can once more accuse the West of hypocrisy over its so-called stifling of free speech. This project was perhaps a win-win for Kremlin propagandists. Win if it was shown, win if it was banned. But if you'd listened to this channel for any length of time, I try to make the distinction between free speech and paid speech. If a malign actor or an openly aggressive, revanchist state like Russia invests money in an information project with the aim of manipulating the media space and public discourse to alter both perceptions and policies in that country to favor its own strategic interests, then that is paid for speech, not free speech. And if the parties creating and disseminating those media products don't declare their financial interests, that is, disclose in transparent fashion who is funding the project so we can better understand their motives and objectives, then really this is not free speech at all, but it is an informational weapon, an assault on public discourse. There is a lot of finger pointing at who made the decision. And it looks like there are actually many organizations, public and private, who funded this film. So explains Ihor Mikhailichin, executive director of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. We will be asking and demanding accountability with regards to the public money and for all private funders to justify how they could have decided this was a good project to spend money on. It's easy to understand how this is, in fact, a piece of Russian propaganda, he stated. Well, we'll be examining how easy the propaganda narratives are to spot later in this video. So how are opponents challenging the filmmakers and the festival organizers? The ethics of Trofimova's reporting are the first thing to be challenged. The concern was raised about Trofimova not having entered Ukraine through official channels, that is, operating in the occupied parts of the country that are still considered Ukraine's sovereign territories under international law. If it is indeed the case that Trofimova has illegally crossed the internationally recognized Ukraine-Russian border, then she has violated Ukrainian law and possibly breached Canadian sanctions. This is indeed something she acknowledges, saying she reached the front line by entering from the Russian side, where border control is essentially non-existent due to the heavy fighting. This was stated in a September the 8th interview with the Canadian newspaper Globe and Mail. I'm a citizen of Russia, she said, and by Russian standards, this is now considered to be Russian territory. You can just pass through there if you have a passport. Never mind the context that this is actually a legally occupied sovereign Ukrainian territory. I wouldn't have been able to cover both sides of the front line, she added pointedly. I got this incredible chance. Did my critics expect that I would phone up the embassy in Kiev and ask if it was okay? The defensiveness and snarky sense of entitlement in Trofimova's tone is absolutely clear. Trofimova has claimed that she was embedded with the Russian military in Ukraine for 7 months, but also insists this was done without obtaining the Russian Defense Ministry's permission. To experts and historians, this statement is barely credible. One cannot simply film on the Russian side of the front without being challenged at every turn. For those with the requisite permissions, then all opportunities are open. Without the passes, papers, and permissions to film, nothing is possible, and a reporter would risk swift detention or far worse. The episode we did on the channel about the gadget ban in the Russian military and the penalties for breaking that code make it clear, I think, that to bring a bunch of complex recording equipment to the front and film extensively without being embedded in the army is simply a ludicrous idea. It's an absolutely impossible thing to do. Media outlets like the Kiev Independent have tried to find any instances where a genuinely independent journalist has reported on the ground with the Russian military without such permissions. Of course, they have found no such examples since the full-scale war began because there are not any. Further, suspicion is also raised by the fact that Trofimova has worked extensively in the past as a documentary maker for Russia Today, the global propaganda media arm of the Kremlin. So, what benefits are there to the Russian propaganda machine from this film? Firstly, the work portrays Russian soldiers in a sympathetic light. This has led to the statement by Ivan Baker, one of the most prominent Ukrainian Canadian lawmakers, calling for the Toronto Film Festival to cancel all screenings. But it goes further and asks the Canada Media Fund to investigate how and why their funding was used to support a propagandistic project. Baker accuses the documentary of whitewashing Russia's crimes against the people of Ukraine by falsely portraying members of Russia's military as victims and by absolving them of their responsibility for the invasion of Ukraine and the war crimes they have committed there. Russians at War is, at its core, an anti-war film, so say the makers. It is unauthorized by Russian officials and was made at great personal risk to the filmmaker, who was under constant threat of arrest and incarceration for trying to tell an unofficial story. This is what the filmmakers have claimed in a statement. But this is another well-known yet extraordinary authoritarian technique. Fabricate a dispute between the government and so-called independent voices, which lends them credibility and creates the illusion of plurality and freedom. But the so-called opponents or dissident voices remain regime puppets and are playing along to a pre-agreed script and are really taking no risks at all. Why are the event organizers sticking with the film? And indeed, why do so many cultural figures seek to absolve Russians and the great Russian culture from crimes committed by Russia and Russians? There is substantial and growing evidence of war crimes committed by Russian soldiers after 2.5 years of brutal aggression by Ukraine's neighbor. Yet some cling to the hope that the crimes are Putin's and his alone. How can a nation of nearly 150 million people, largely supportive of the invasion of its neighbor, without protest or pushback? How can that be? How can such heinous crimes be committed by a country that has produced Tolstoy and Tchaikovsky, etc., etc.? But reality can be terrifying. Not only that ordinary people, under certain circumstances, can behave with extreme cruelty and inhumanity, but also that Russians are not exactly the same as Ukrainians, are not the same as us either. They can commit acts of torture, rape, and murder, and show very little empathy for their victims or contrition for their criminal acts. Hannah Arendt famously explored this terrifying truth in her 1963 book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. Adolf Eichmann was a high-ranking Nazi official who helped to orchestrate the logistics of the Holocaust. Arendt wrote about how evil manifests itself not in monstrous aberrations that belong to the realm of fairy tales, but in individuals who choose to follow horrific orders without much hesitation or introspection. The filmmaker has been very manipulative of how she's been looking for support and receiving it, Mikhailishin said. But the greater scandal is the world's failure to fully comprehend the threat that Russia poses to open and pluralistic societies, and the ease with which apologists for genocide have been given platforms to spread hate and falsehoods. It's remarkable that some of the most effective mediums for the propagation of Russian source narratives are the world's most esteemed cultural institutions. Amid genocidal slaughter on a scale not seen since World War II, this film that seeks to cut through the fog of war and humanize Russian soldiers while claiming to have no knowledge of any of the crimes that are committed or the immorality that has taken place, despite vast documentary evidence to show that they have actually happened. Let's examine then this claim that the film is an anti-war film. In the trailer, a soldier claims Ukraine and Russia are inseparable and that he misses the brotherly union of the two countries. Right out of the gate, here are two classic Russian propaganda tropes that underpin their justifications for the invasion. In both the Russian Empire and Soviet Empire, the Russian language and culture dominated. Throughout their intertwined and miserable history, Russian dominance was enforced through violent subjugation. In the Kiev Independent, Kate Tsurkan explains what this soldier is actually expressing is nostalgia for an era when the Ukrainian nation state was denied the right to exist. Trofimova has publicly stated that she witnessed no war crimes being committed during her time on the front line, but does not examine the idea that they may have been screened from seeing these things, or that these things may have occurred in other places at other times. There is no mention of the witnesses to these crimes, the victims, or to the survivors. Describing Russian soldiers as mere tools in a larger political game, as the director suggests, is close to echoing a dangerous talking point propagated by the Russian government that it was right all along to invade Ukraine in order to halt NATO's expansion and encroachment on its so-called sphere of influence. It also marks a shift in propagandistic technique away from those who shout loudest about the correctness of Russia's actions and seek to amplify those supposedly neutral voices who are simply asking questions, but seem to not be so interested in seeking objective truth. Quiet skeptics can foster uncertainty in otherwise clear-cut narratives, can confuse people and lead them to inaction. Because where a case is morally clear-cut, it demands action. Where culpability for a crime is uncertain, it leads to indecision and inaction. Ultimately, these voices of doubt, the so-called two-sidism and whataboutism, can inflict the most harm, and it is an absolutely core strategy for Russian propaganda, both internally and externally. Kate Tsurkan of the Kiev Independent explains it is our responsibility to categorically reject any attempts to excuse or rehabilitate the Russian war crimes being committed in Ukraine, and to ensure that the suffering of Russia's victims is neither forgotten nor minimized. But we should not be surprised that Russia uses international cinema and cultural festivals to push narratives in favor of their genocidal war in Ukraine. Russians at War is a propaganda film made by professional propagandists with the aim of manipulating public perceptions of the war that lead to a strategic objective of the Russians. That is, don't fight back against Russians because they are humans too. This is a doubly cynical exercise because it is a piece of aggressive victimhood, the aim of which is actually to perpetuate violence and suffering and dissuade people from opposing this very aggression. So, what can we discern in the content of the film that marks it out as propaganda? I'm grateful to Ivan Baker and many others on Twitter who have done analysis of the film's narratives. And here we go. This is the breakdown line by line. At the 5-minute 20-second mark, an attempt to emphasize that local military separatists protect families and children and are not part of Russia's proxy army in the war launched by Russia in 2014. At minute 6 and 34 seconds, an attempt is made to cast doubt on documented war crimes of the Russian military in Bucha by asking soldiers if they really committed war crimes there or saw anybody else doing so. Of course, their answer comes back as no. At the 11th minute and 12 seconds in a conversation with a Russian soldier, an attempt is made to show that Russian soldiers are tired of the war and want it to end. But there's no discussion of how it can end, and indeed no discussion of how and who started it. At minute 14 and 25 seconds, an attempt is made to evoke sympathy for a young guy, an army contractor with an appealing smile, who makes a tragic face when talking about the death of friends in the war. But he expresses no sympathy for Ukrainians whom he attacked and for their land which he invaded. At minute 17 and 10 seconds, a local man is shown promoting narratives in the Russian language about a coup and armed rebellion in Kiev, which, according to him, was carried out purely by the US in 2014. At minute 18 and 30 seconds, Russian military man is shown promoting the narrative that Ukrainians throw away Western weapons when retreating. But what is actually shown in the footage are the disposable cartridges from anti-tank weapons that have already been fired, and so they are not active weapons at all. At minute 20 and 10 seconds, the Russian military is constantly given the opportunity to promote the narratives in interviews that Russians never want war, that Russia never attacks, it only ends wars. Ukrainians are also called fascists, which was apparently Russia's core justification for starting the war. And of course, it's a complete lie. In minute 23 and 5 seconds, a part of the video shows soldiers on the phone with their wives and children. The journalist allows the Russian occupiers to promote the narrative that they are there fighting for their families and their children, instead of emphasizing that the soldiers are aggressors who came to kill people and their children in a foreign country and seize their territory. At minute 23 and 28 seconds, the military makes a statement to the film that, for them, holiday is victory. The journalist does not comment on the statement or challenge it at all. What do they mean by victory? And if that's a holiday for Russians, then surely for Ukrainians, it's not a holiday. It would simply mean annihilation. At minute 25 and 12 seconds, accompanied by tragic music and without commentary, the film shows a dead civilian in a car in occupied Donetsk. But crucial context is left out. The Russian military often uses residential areas of Donetsk for shelling the Ukrainian army, hiding behind locals, and then the return fire can kill civilians. But these deaths are then treated as fodder for Russian propaganda. At minute 26 and 24 seconds, the film enables a Russian occupier to say that they are not monsters, but just people who protect their countrymen here, and that it is their motherland, and this land is historically theirs, none of which, of course, is factually accurate. At minute 26 and 55 seconds, the occupier propagandist is freely allowed to talk about the planned capture of Kiev and the creation of a Kremlin puppet regime in Ukraine and transformation of independent Ukraine into a Russian enclave. At minute 27 and 55 seconds, the film allows the occupier to say, without any additional commentary, that they are simply taking their land and will carry on doing so until the last Ukrainian Nazi is killed. The journalist even says yes, agreeing with the occupier. At the 30-minute mark, an attempt is made to show locals suffering from shelling without telling any context of where these shells are coming from or what caused it. At minute 30 and 50 seconds, we're shown an elderly woman who supports Russia and criticizes Zelensky. Of course, it's amazing what people who've been consuming Russian propaganda forcibly 24/7 for 9 years will say when they are not allowed to consume any alternative narratives via mainstream media. And finally, at minute 41 and 40 seconds, the journalist asks the Russian occupiers, do they feel that the world and the West do not understand them? To which the occupier replies, of course, if they, the West, understood, then everything would have ended a long time ago. He is, of course, referring to the suspension of aid to Ukraine and the full capture of Ukraine by Russia. This allows the occupiers to promote the narrative that they are not actually invaders and are simply defending their own land and their own people. No agency is allowed for Ukrainians and no concept of sovereign territory or the rights of Ukrainian citizens. None of that, of course, is mentioned in the film at all. In conclusion, we must remember that Russia never allows real journalists into the occupied territories except for very rare occasions. And in that case, their trips are closely curated and they are always chaperoned. A good example is a video made by an extremely deluded journalist from a German network recently who went to show the so-called reconstruction of Mariupol by Russia in a positive light and devoid of any context about who lived there before and why the city needed to be reconstructed from the ashes. In this supposedly balanced film, Russians at War, the director pushes narratives that the Russian government would hardly object to, and in many cases promotes at every turn through their mainstream propagandistic channels. There are no alternative voices opposing the war and motives for the war, or anyone that expresses empathy for the Ukrainian victims of the war either. Finally, and this is important context, Trofimova has made 11 films for Russia Today, which is a leading state-owned propaganda outlet whose employees have only just been indicted this week by the US Department of Justice. The claim that her film was unauthorized by Russian officials and was made at great personal risk to the filmmaker is a ludicrous yarn. The idea that they were under constant threat of arrest and incarceration for trying to tell an unofficial story is a total fabrication, frankly, is an insult to the intelligence of informed observers and to anyone who diligently opposes the regime of Putin and his criminal war. Trofimova is herself a former and likely still is employee of a fascist state, whose stated aim is genocide in Ukraine. We can have little doubt that Trofimova's filmmaking was meticulously monitored by the FSB, GRU, and other relevant officials from the Ministry of Defense. If they had found it objectionable in any way, it would never have seen the light of day. Instead, it clearly suits their purposes, which makes it pure propaganda.